On the edge of a whispering frontier town, folks spoke of two figures who should never have met. Elijah Crane, a mountain recluse who had reached 50 without ever knowing a woman's touch, and Lila Mae, a weeping widow cast from her home with nothing but sorrow in her eyes. One night, fate drove her to his cabin door, where secrets long buried stirred to life. Why had this man chosen solitude over love? Could the widow's broken heart awaken his own? And when darkness from her past returned, would the mountain man stand as her protector or retreat into silence? When a widow's tears met a mountain man's silence, something changed forever in that frozen cabin. But who truly needed saving and who was finally seen? Every time I read your comments, I'm reminded that these stories aren't just about the past, they're about the values we still carry today. If you believe in redemption, quiet strength, and the healing power of kindness, then you're part of this story too. Let me know which state you're watching from, give this video a like, and subscribe so we can keep sharing tales that bring us together, one heartfelt moment at a time. They said she came from the east, where the land was flatter and the pain was older. Folks in the town of Pine Hollow first saw her just past dusk, stumbling along the edge of the cedar break, skirts muddied, face veiled, hands clutching a satchel too heavy for her size. The butcher's boy claimed he saw red seeping through the burlap. The schoolmarm swore she heard crying carried on the wind, soft and breathless, like someone trying not to be heard. By morning, the widow was gone. Only her footprints remained, winding northward toward the high country, where the land grew steep and the sky pressed close. It wasn't long before the whispers began. Not about her name, not yet, but about where she went, about who she might have been running from, or toward. "You think she don't know what's up that mountain?" asked old Rusk, the one-eyed trapper with gums like dry corn husks. "Ain't no accident she went that way." The townsfolk muttered over coffee and bread, pretending they didn't care, but their eyes flicked to the ridge, to Wren's Peak, sharp and cold and always snow-dusted, even in early fall, a place of bad memories and darker stories. It had been nearly 20 years since Elijah Crane came down from those hills, 20 years since he buried his wife in the churchyard and vanished without a word. They said he built a cabin up there, away from judgment, away from pity. Some believed he died years ago, bones tucked under frostbitten earth. Others swore he still lived, his beard to his chest, eyes like a wounded dog's, hunting by moonlight and speaking to no one. Yet now there were signs. Smoke from the ridgeline, a deer carcass strung and left to hang behind the trading post cleaned, cured, then vanished before dawn. The preacher's wife claimed she heard an axe ringing out just before Sunday service. They all looked up the mountain and said the same thing without saying it. He's watching again. So when the widow disappeared, dragging her haunted silence and that bloodied satchel behind her, folks connected the threads the way scared people always do, with half-truths and full conviction. Maybe she knew him, someone offered at the mercantile. Maybe she was his kin. He ain't got no kin. They burned in that fire. Everyone knows. Then maybe she was sent, the blacksmith said, voice low, eyes narrowed. Sent by who? God or the devil, but no one went after her. No one followed those narrow boot tracks that led into the timberline, even as the first flakes of snow began to fall. Pine Hollow folk had long memories, and fear deeper than they cared to admit. They watched the ridge and locked their doors, telling themselves it wasn't their business. She chose her path. She walked to him. Still, behind their shutters and shawls, they wondered, who was she? What sorrow weighed her down? And why would a woman alone and grieving climb into the arms of the one man everyone else had fled? The letter of the law was a cruel thing, Lila Mae thought, especially when wielded by crueler hands. The ink had barely dried on her husband's death certificate when Silas Hawthorne arrived at the estate, boots tracking mud across the parlor rug, voice slick with mock mourning. He brought papers, ones her husband had never shown her, and a lawyer from 2 towns over who didn't meet her eye once. They said the land, the house, even the livestock fell to the next male heir, and that heir, by the will's final clause, was Silas. Her name wasn't mentioned. Her grief wasn't relevant. Lila hadn't argued, not aloud, not in front of the lawyer, and not when Silas stood in the hall that evening, holding her wrist too tight and telling her she had until morning to gather her things and go. "You got no place here," he spat, eyes cold, breath thick with whiskey. "You were never more than borrowed, and now he's dead. So what are you?" That night she did not sleep. She packed slowly, quietly, fitting what she could into a satchel that had once belonged to her father, a keepsake from a better time. She took her husband's journal, a silver locket, and a few faded sketches she had drawn before the world taught her to hide her talents. As she moved through the house, every corner whispered of what had been nights by the fire, laughter soft as candlelight, the way he had loved her without possession. But now all of it felt smothered, stolen. The man she had married was gone, and in his place stood Silas, who loomed like a vulture over the remains. At dawn she stood at the edge of the porch with her satchel in one hand and her veil drawn low. Her cheek ached where his ring had left a bruise 2 days earlier when she'd asked to stay until the first snowfall. "Don't make me raise a hand again," he'd said, and the way he smiled after made her stomach turn. She didn't wait for goodbyes. The field stretched empty and pale beneath the weight of a gray sky. She walked past the barn, the old willow tree, the broken fence post her husband had meant to fix last spring. Her boots crunched the frost-bitten grass, and each step away felt both like a mercy and a funeral. The road offered no company. No wagon passed. No kind soul called out. She didn't cry at first, not until she reached the edge of the woods where the trees grew thick and the land sloped up toward the distant hills. There, the sob broke free, sharp and breathless, swallowed quickly by the cold. She pressed a hand to her face, not for modesty, but to hide the pain she could no longer carry in silence. There was no plan, no destination, only a direction, away. Away from cruelty, away from a house that once promised safety and became a prison. The satchel in her hand grew heavier with every mile, not from weight, but from memory. When the wind picked up and the sky began to spit snow, she didn't stop. The trees whispered ahead, and somewhere beyond them, high where the smoke sometimes rose from the ridgeline, she thought, no, she hoped, there was a place untouched by men like Silas, a place where a woman could vanish, and perhaps, one day, be found again. The cold bit deeper than any hunger. Lila's hands, wrapped in the thinning ends of her shawl, trembled with every step. Her boots were soaked through from crossing the half-frozen creek at the bottom of the ridge, and her skirts clung wet and stiff to her calves. Each breath came as a whisper of frost, her lungs aching from the thin air that only seemed to grow sharper the higher she climbed. Snow flurried in aimless swirls around her, soft but ceaseless, dusting her hair and lashes until she looked almost ghost-like, the black of her coat dimmed to ash. She hadn't spoken in hours, hadn't cried. The body had a way of forgetting grief when survival pressed in. Her stomach had turned hollow, gnawing at itself, and her legs ached with a tremor that started deep in the bone. But still she climbed, drawn by something she couldn't name. She no longer knew if she was walking toward shelter or simply running until her legs gave out. She didn't care. Either way, it would be over. Then, just beyond the thinning trees and past a split in the narrow trail, she saw it half shrouded in snowfall and mist, like something conjured by the desperate mind. A small log structure tucked into the slope, smoke rising thinly from the stone chimney. The windows were dark, no lanterns glowed within, but the smoke was real. So was the neat pile of firewood stacked beside the door, the marks of chopped wood half hidden beneath the snowdrift. Her knees nearly buckled at the sight. She didn't knock, not at first. She reached the steps and stood trembling, swaying like a woman drunk on hope or fever. One gloved hand reached out and touched the rough-hewn doorframe, steadying herself. Her voice had left her hours ago, but she found it now, scraping past her lips in a rasp. "Please." No answer, no movement from inside. She tried again, louder this time. "Please, someone." The door remained shut. The cold crept down her spine, cruel and slow. Her strength gave way before her will did. Her legs folded beneath her, and she collapsed hard against the threshold. One arm still stretched out across the wood. The satchel slipped from her grip and spilled open beside her, papers fluttering, a locket tumbling into the snow. Her breath clouded the air, sharp and shallow, but she didn't rise again. From the tree line beyond the cabin, hidden in the hush of snowfall. Something stirred. A shadow shifted behind the pines, tall, still, and watchful. He had seen her coming long before she reached the cabin, had heard the uneven steps, the stifled sobs, the collapse. He had watched many creatures wander these woods, fox, deer, even the occasional lost hunter, but none like her, not in all these years. Elijah Crane remained where he stood, axe in hand, his breath slow and measured. The snow fell around him in silence. She hadn't seen him, but he had seen enough. And still, she had come. The knock was soft, barely there, more like a breath than a plea. But Elijah heard it all the same. He stood just inside the cabin, his frame filling the doorway, the iron latch resting against his palm. For a long moment, he didn't move. The wind howled across the peak, dragging the cold in through the cracks between the timbers, and still he didn't open the door. Through the frosted pane of glass, he could see the shape crumpled at his threshold, a woman, small and shivering, her cloak heavy with snow, her gloved hand curled weakly around the edge of the wood. She hadn't knocked again. His first instinct was to turn away. He had done it before. Years ago, a hunter bleeding from the leg, begging for shelter. Elijah had left him to crawl back down the trail alone. The man had survived, and the message had spread. No one climbed this far anymore, not even out of curiosity. But this wasn't a man with a rifle or an aimless trespasser. This was a woman. Her face, when he'd caught a glimpse before she collapsed, was pale and strained, streaked with tears, and something darker, something that clung behind her eyes like loss that never quite dried. He told himself to shut the door, that whatever trouble she carried would only root itself into his soil. The cabin was a tomb by choice, and he had no use for strangers digging up bones. And yet, he lingered. With a grunt low in his throat, he unlatched the door. The cold rushed in like a warning, but he ignored it and stepped onto the porch. She didn't move. Her breath was shallow, lips tinged blue, lashes fluttering. Her satchel lay open beside her, its contents scattered papers, a child's drawing, a strip of cloth with blood dried at the seam. Elijah bent slowly, joints stiff with years of solitude and silence. He scooped her into his arms like she weighed nothing, her head lolling against his chest. She didn't flinch, didn't resist. She simply sighed, and he felt the sound more than heard it, a small exhale of trust or surrender, it was hard to tell which. Inside, the fire had burned low, but he stoked it without setting her down, then laid her gently onto the cot near the hearth. He worked in silence, wrapping her in a thick woolen blanket, his touch rough but careful. He poured water into the kettle and hung it over the flame. When he stepped back, he did not speak. He just watched. For hours she didn't stir, not until dusk fell and the cabin took on the flickering amber glow of lamplight. Her eyes opened slowly, and she really looked at him for the first time. "You're real," she whispered. He said nothing. "I'm sorry," she added, her voice thin and cracking. "I didn't know where else to go." Elijah turned away, not because he was angry, but because something in her voice, in her eyes, struck a place inside him that had long gone quiet. Something he had buried with the woman and child who once lay in this same cot, beneath this same roof. He didn't know why he let her stay. He only knew that he had. The quiet inside the cabin was different than the quiet outside. In the woods, silence was movement, the rustle of branches, the call of a distant bird, the whisper of snow against the trees. But here, within these 4 log walls, silence was stillness, thick and unmoving, like the air had learned to hold its breath. Lila sat curled in the chair closest to the fire, wrapped in a woolen blanket that smelled faintly of cedar and smoke. Her boots, removed and placed neatly near the hearth, steamed gently from the warmth. She hadn't stopped shivering, but the cold no longer reached her bones. Elijah moved with purpose, but no urgency. He stirred the pot over the fire, ladled thick stew into a wooden bowl, and placed it on the table near her without a word. The smell made her eyes sting. She hadn't eaten in nearly 2 days, but it wasn't hunger that made her tremble as she reached for the spoon. It was the fact that someone had fed her without demanding anything in return. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice still raw. Elijah said nothing. He returned to the far side of the room and sat on a low stool, back slightly turned. He didn't watch her eat, didn't ask questions, didn't press her with the suspicious kindness she had grown so accustomed to in men who wanted something in exchange. He simply was. She looked around the cabin between careful bites. It was plain, but not crude. The walls were lined with shelves of books, their spines faded, some tilted as if left mid-read years ago and never straightened. Tools hung neatly by the door, an axe, a bow, a small satchel of snares. Above the fireplace hung a black and white daguerreotype in a wooden frame, a woman with dark hair and kind eyes holding a baby wrapped in a hand-stitched quilt. Neither smiled, but there was warmth between them, even in silver tones. Her gaze drifted left and caught. A cradle sat in the far corner of the cabin, untouched. No dust disturbed the curve of its rim. A small patchwork blanket lay folded inside it, colors dulled by time. No toys, no movement. Just memory, preserved like something holy or forbidden. Lila looked away quickly, her chest tightening. She knew grief when she saw it. She wore it herself like a second skin. She tried to speak again. "You live here alone?" Still, no answer. "I don't mean to intrude. I didn't know where else to go." Elijah didn't look at her. He stared into the fire, jaw set like stone, hands resting on his knees. If he heard her, he gave no sign. But when the fire popped, startling her slightly, he rose, took a second blanket from a nearby trunk, and draped it over her shoulders without a word. Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from something more dangerous: safety. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The storm outside thickened, pressing against the windows. But inside, the silence softened, turning from emptiness into something that felt almost like peace. The snow came heavy and early that year, blanketing the mountain in thick drifts that swallowed whole paths and bent the pine limbs low with white burden. For 3 days, the sky never cleared. Gray morning bled into gray night, and the world outside Elijah's cabin turned soft and shapeless, as if the wilderness itself were holding its breath. But inside, the fire burned constant, and life continued, not loud or lively, but steady and quiet, like the rhythm of breath after weeping. Lila learned quickly. The silence that lived in the cabin was not to be feared, only respected. She no longer tried to fill it with words. Instead, she spoke with her hands, with the careful way she swept the hearth, with how she laid out the bowls for supper, or how she folded his shirts after they dried above the fire. She rose at first light without being asked, wrapped herself in layers, and ventured outside to help with the chores. The first time she followed him out into the snow, Elijah said nothing, only paused long enough for her to catch up. The woodpile had dwindled from the storm, and they worked side by side, gathering fallen branches and splitting logs. Her hands blistered beneath the gloves, but she never complained. Not when her palms stung, not when the wind cut through her shawl. Elijah noticed, though he never spoke of it. That night, a pair of thicker gloves appeared beside her cot, left without explanation. She didn't thank him aloud. She only wore them the next day and chopped twice as much. There were goats, 2, 3 of them, all thin and cranky, kept in a small lean-to behind the cabin. Lila took to them with a quiet affection, learning their moods, coaxing them to eat, even singing once under her breath as she cleaned the stalls. Elijah passed by then, a bucket in hand, and paused for half a second. His eyes softened not into a smile, not fully, but she saw it. A flicker of something not entirely made of stone. She began to notice the way he moved through the world, not just with strength, but with precision. Every tool had its place, every task its time. He wasted no motion, spoke no idle words. Yet beneath the silence, there was something else, something steady and watchful. When she slipped once on the icy trail near the creek, his hand shot out and caught her elbow before she hit the ground. He didn't say a word, only held her steady for a moment longer than necessary, then released her and kept walking. But her heart had caught the message. This was not a man of cruelty or carelessness. This was a man who had once loved with his whole being, and who now feared what love might destroy. In the evenings they shared meals by the fire. She did most of the talking, sometimes aloud, sometimes just to herself. He listened, or didn't, it was hard to tell. but now and then his brow would twitch, or he would glance her way when she wasn't looking. She spoke of books she used to read, of her mother's pie, of drawing pictures as a girl. He never responded, but one morning she awoke to find a book placed by her seat, a collection of fables, worn at the edges, its corners softened by time. The snow piled higher each day, paths disappeared, and the world seemed to shrink to just this cabin, this man, and the sound of her own heartbeat echoing against the wooden walls. And yet, somehow, Lila didn't feel trapped. She felt, for the first time in a long while, like she had stepped out of the storm and into something quiet and good. Not safe, exactly, but sacred. The quiet of the mountain had a strange way of seeping into the soul, softening its edges, dulling the ache of old wounds without ever promising to erase them. Lila had begun to breathe again, slow and deep, the way a person does when they no longer fear their own skin. She kept her hands busy, mending a tear in the bedding, patching Elijah's threadbare coat, sketching by the fire with the stub of a charcoal pencil she'd found at the back of a drawer. In the stillness of the days, she almost felt like someone whole. But the nights betrayed her. In sleep, her mind pulled her backward into rooms that stank of pipe smoke and spoiled food, into the clink of Silas's belt buckle, the scrape of his boots across the floor. In dreams, he came for her again and again, breath hot with rot, his voice like gravel. You were never yours to keep. She woke often in the dark, trembling, a scream caught behind her teeth, her nightdress soaked through with sweat. And always, the fear was not that he had found her, but that Elijah might hear her cries and send her away. She never spoke of the dreams, but the shadows under her eyes grew darker and her voice thinner. One night, when the fire had burned low and the moonlight pooled blue and silent across the cabin floor, she woke to find her cot empty of warmth and the room absent of Elijah. The chair by the hearth was cold, the door slightly ajar. She wrapped herself in a blanket and stepped outside. The wind had quieted, the snow deep and unbroken, but for a single path of boot prints leading away from the cabin toward the edge of the trees. She followed them. It was not far. Beyond the goat's pen, nestled at the base of a wind-stunted spruce, stood a crooked stone half swallowed by snow and time. Elijah knelt before it, bareheaded, coat open, hands resting on his thighs as if in prayer. He did not move as she approached, nor when she stopped behind him, uncertain whether to speak or turn away. The grave was simple, no name chiseled in its face, only a child's faded ribbon tied around the branch of a sapling nearby. Lila opened her mouth, but the words failed her. She looked down at him, at the slope of his shoulders beneath the worn flannel, at the stillness that clung to him like mourning. He spoke before she could. Lila, just her name. Nothing more. Not an order, not a question, just the sound of it, carried on a breath that trembled at the edges. She knelt beside him. The snow was cold through the blanket, but she didn't care. She didn't need to ask who lay beneath the stone. She didn't need to ask why he was out here, in the middle of the night, with his face tipped to the stars, like a man searching for what was taken. She knew, and in knowing, she did not feel afraid. He didn't speak again, and she didn't press him. They stayed like that, silent in the dark, two broken hearts drawn to the same wound. When he rose at last and walked back toward the cabin, he paused, looked over his shoulder, and waited for her. She followed without a word. The door closed behind them, and the quiet that returned was no longer empty. It was shared. The attic wasn't large, just a crawl space above the rafters with a slanted ceiling, and old wood that groaned beneath each careful step. Lila hadn't meant to go exploring. She'd gone up looking for extra linens, having noticed the bitter cold creeping in at night no matter how thick the fire burned. A loose board in the roof, maybe. She thought she might stuff it with something, but in the farthest corner, past an abandoned rocking chair and a lantern caked with dust, she found the trunk. It was made of dark oak, the iron latches speckled with rust but still strong. The top was worn smooth in the middle, as if someone's hand had rested there 1,000 times before. There was no lock, only a simple clasp. She didn't open it at first. She just knelt, brushing snow dust from the lid, her fingers tracing the faint initials carved into the wood E. C. She hesitated. Something about it felt private, sacred, a thing untouched by time because no one dared to touch it. Still kneeling, she slowly lifted the lid. Inside, the air changed. It was as if the cold deepened, or maybe it was just the weight of memory rising like mist. Folded with precision were tiny garments, children's dresses, a pair of soft woolen booties, a small knit cap. Nestled among them was a withered bouquet of dried wildflowers, petals brittle but still clinging to color. At the bottom lay a journal, leather-bound, its strap cracked with age. Lila's hand hovered above it. She didn't open the journal. Something in her heart told her it wasn't hers to read. Not yet. She closed the lid gently, like tucking a child back to sleep, and turned to leave. But he was there. Elijah stood at the top of the ladder, shoulders squared, face in shadow. For the first time since she'd arrived, his eyes burned not with grief, not with quiet watchfulness, but with fury. A flash of something primal and sharp, like a wound suddenly torn open. His chest rose once, then again, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscles tremble. "I was just looking for blankets," she said quickly, standing. Her voice was soft, apologetic, but not afraid. He didn't move, didn't speak. "I didn't read anything," she added, her voice barely a breath now. "I wouldn't." Still nothing. Only that look, rage, yes, but buried beneath it was pain, so deep and old it seemed to echo through the beams of the house. His gaze dropped to the trunk, then back to her, and for a heartbeat it looked like he might shout, might slam the lid shut and banish her from his world entirely. But he didn't. He turned, descended the ladder without a word. She remained frozen for a moment, hands still clenched at her sides, the sting of unshed tears building behind her eyes. Then, carefully, she followed, closing the attic behind her as if sealing away a ghost. When she reached the bottom, Elijah had already retreated to the porch, where the wind had picked up and snow was starting to fall again. He sat alone in the cold, coat open, staring out into the white, as if hoping it might erase what had been unearthed. Lila did not speak to him that evening. She stoked the fire, set out supper, and left the attic untouched. But in the silence that followed, something had changed. She had seen the place where his sorrow lived, and now he knew it. The first Sunday thaw brought with it a glimmer of mud through the snow and the faint smell of pine warmed by the sun. In Pine Hollow, the church bell rang clear through the crisp air, its sound chasing away the last whispers of winter from the rooftops. Folks gathered as they always did, bundled in wool, voices hushed, eyes sharper than necessary. Gossip clung to them like steam from their breath. Most of it was the usual whose cow had birthed twins, which boy had gone courting the blacksmith's daughter, but beneath it all, something quieter stirred. Hester Dunley knew the rhythm of the town better than most. She had delivered half the children seated in those pews and buried more than a few mothers who'd never drawn another breath after labor. The town called her the midwife out of habit, but she was more than that. She saw what others didn't, heard what others ignored. And this morning, as the hymn came to a close and the preacher stepped from the pulpit to shake hands by the door, she waited near the coat rack, eyes set on him with a purpose. "Hester," the preacher greeted warmly, "you've got a look about you today." "I've got eyes, same as you," she replied, pulling her shawl tighter over her shoulders. "And I seen smoke coming from Wren's Peak again, regular now." The preacher's brow furrowed. "Elijah? Ayu." He glanced about, lowered his voice. "Could be hunters. Could be." She let the words hang a moment. "But it ain't." The preacher studied her, his fingers tightening over his worn Bible. "I passed near there Tuesday last," she said, tone even. "Gathering pine bark for tincture. Saw the smoke with my own eyes, rising from that chimney the way it used to 20 years back. But it weren't just smoke. There was movement. 2 figures, one of 'em small. A woman, I think." The preacher's frown deepened. "You think he's taken someone up there?" "I think he's sheltering someone." "Hey, winder than ever." "That's a bold claim." She stepped closer. "You remember the way they all turned on him. After the fire, after his wife and child, God rest them, were laid in the ground. No trial, no inquiry, just whispers and judgment. And so he left. He didn't just leave, Hester. He vanished." "People don't vanish without reason," she said softly. Not for 20 years. Not unless the world gives them no safe place to stand. He looked down then, the weight of old guilt pressing like a hand to his collar. I'm not saying we ought to interfere, Hester continued. But I am saying this. Elijah Crane ain't the monster folks say. He's a man with a wound so deep he couldn't speak over it. And now someone's up there with him. Someone who might need protecting, or healing, or both. The preacher nodded slowly, eyes distant now. Keep your ears open, Reverend, she said gently, and tell your flock to mind their words. The Lord may listen closer than they think. With that, she turned and stepped out into the muddy street, leaving behind the scent of pine resin and a silence thicker than the closing hymn. The storm had come fast and hard, drumming against the cabin roof with a fury that rattled the shutters and buried the world in white. Night fell early, as it always did on the mountain, and by the time Lila lit the second lantern and set a third log on the fire, she began to worry. Elijah had gone out before midday with his rifle and little more than a coil of rope and his heavy coat. He hadn't spoken when he left, only nodded once, a gesture that by now she understood to mean, I'll be back before dark. But dark had come, and he hadn't. She didn't pace, he wouldn't have wanted that, but her fingers kept to work just to keep from trembling. The stew boiled low. The goats were already fed. Her sketchbook lay open and untouched beside the hearth. Then, a knock. Not on the door, but a heavy thud 2 times, and then the groan of the wood as it opened. Elijah stood in the frame, soaked in snow and sweat, leaning harder than usual on the doorframe. His face was paler than the frost clinging to his beard, and his left sleeve was dark with blood. Lila was on her feet before she could think. He stepped in and closed the door behind him with a grunt, stumbling once before he caught the edge of the table. Elijah, she breathed. I'm fine, he muttered, but he wasn't. She moved to him, hesitated for half a heartbeat, then gently touched his elbow. He didn't pull away. That was new. Slowly, carefully, she helped him to the chair near the fire and began unbuttoning his coat. Beneath it, his shirt was torn at the bicep, soaked through with red. A long gash curved down his arm, jagged and angry, still bleeding. What happened? Bore, he said through clenched teeth. Didn't see him soon enough. She fetched a clean cloth and the tin of salve from the shelf, her movements brisk but steady. Her hands didn't shake. She'd tended worse wounds in her marriage, though none inflicted by animal tusks. She crouched beside him, taking his arm in her lap as she cleaned the wound. He hissed once, jaw twitching, but didn't flinch. You're lucky, she murmured, dabbing gently. Another inch deeper, and you'd have met your maker out there. These tangers. Maybe I was supposed to. Her fingers paused. She looked up, startled not by the words, but by the voice. It was the most he'd spoken in a single breath since she arrived. She didn't answer him, not with words. Instead, she threaded the needle with shaking fingers and began stitching. It was rough work, but clean. She tied the knot and pressed a final cloth to the skin, wrapping it tight. All the while, he watched her, not just endured her touch, but watched as if seeing something he hadn't expected to find again. When she finished, she lowered his arm gently to his lap. Their eyes met. Thank you, he said, just 2 words, barely audible, over the crackle of the fire. But they settled into her like a promise, not of love, not yet, but of presence, of trust, of a man letting someone back in, thread by thread. You're welcome, she said softly, then rose to fetch him stew. Behind her, he remained still, but something in the air had changed. The thaw had begun. The snow had begun to melt in rivulets, softening the edges of the mountain and carrying the silence with it. Spring was still weeks away, but the thaw had settled into the bones of the land and into the spaces between the man and woman who now shared the quiet cabin. Elijah still spoke little, but when he did, the words came more easily, like water loosed from ice. He let her read aloud by the fire now, let her hum while cooking. He no longer stiffened when her hand brushed his sleeve. That night, the wind had died completely. The world outside the cabin lay breathless, and inside, the air was warm with cedar and stew. Lila had lit a single lantern, low and golden, and sat beside the hearth darning one of his wool socks. Elijah sat across from her, his wounded arm resting in a sling, the healing slow but steady. She looked up from her work, studying him in the firelight. "You were married," she said gently. Not a question, just the shape of knowing spoken aloud. Her voice held no demand, only the softness of an open door. He didn't look at her, not at first. His eyes stayed on the flames, the shadows dancing along the walls. "She died," he said after a long pause. Lila set the sock aside. "She was 24, Elijah went on. "Her name was Miriam. We lived down in the hollow, just past the schoolhouse. I built her a cradle the winter she was expecting." His voice was hoarse, the syllables halting but steady. "She went into labor late," he said. 3 days of it. The midwife couldn't get here in time. I tried to help, but—" He stopped, swallowed. Something went wrong. She bled too fast, too much. By the time the sun came up, she was gone. Lila's throat tightened. "The boy Nathaniel," he came out breathing. "I thought maybe that was the Lord's way of giving something back, but he never nursed. He was gone before the week's end." A log in the fire cracked sharply, but Elijah didn't flinch. "They buried her with the child," he said. "One grave. I stood there with the preacher, said nothing. The sheriff came that night, said it looked suspicious, said no midwife meant no witness. There were rumors that I'd struck her, let her bleed. Some said I'd smothered the child." Lila covered her mouth, tears rising fast and hot. "I didn't fight it," Elijah continued. "Didn't see the point. The town turned their eyes away. Folks I'd built barns with, sat beside in church. I packed what I could and climbed." He finally looked at her then. His eyes, so often hard as flint, were hollow with memory. "I didn't come up here to heal," he said. "I came up here to die slow." Lila rose and crossed to him, her hands trembling. She knelt beside his chair and took his hand in both of hers, pressing it to her cheek. The tears came freely now, not just for him, but for all the wrongs silence had swallowed. "I'm sorry," she whispered, voice thick. "I'm so sorry." And this time, he didn't pull away. He let her cry, let her stay, let her carry the weight with him, just for a while. And for the first time in 2 decades, Elijah Crane did not feel alone. The snow melted slow that year, as if reluctant to release its hold on the mountain. But beneath its retreat, the ground softened, and the air began to carry the scent of thawed earth and new beginnings. Lila stood barefoot near the edge of the clearing, her boots beside her in the slush, sketchbook tucked beneath one arm and a charcoal pencil in hand. Her fingers were cold, but she didn't mind. She was drawing lines in the soil, both imagined and real rows, for carrots, for cabbage, for beans and squash and rosemary. A garden, she would call it a garden, though right now it was just a dream pressed into frostbitten dirt. Elijah watched her from the roof. He was hammering new shingles into place, having stripped the rotted ones in the week after the last snow. His movements were slow but certain. The strength in his arms returned since the boar's wound had healed. He didn't say much, but he stayed near. When she sketched, he built. When she planted, he carried water from the creek. He made her a wooden box for seeds, repaired the fence that had sagged under winter's weight. She found him one morning sanding down the cradle. He didn't explain, and she didn't ask. Their lives had begun to braid quietly together, not with grand confessions or declarations, but through the small, sacred rituals of labor shared. She sang to the goats while he split wood. He left fresh apples on the table when he went out hunting. At night, they sat by the fire with books open in their laps, neither reading aloud, both content in the hush. One morning, as she knelt to press her first seeds into the soil, Lila looked up and caught him watching her, not with guardedness, not with sorrow, but with something almost gentle, the kind of gaze a man gives when he thinks no one will see. She smiled, and for a flicker of a moment, he smiled back. But peace is a delicate thing in a world where greed has no season. Across the valley, down where the river curved like a silver ribbon through the hills, Silas Hawthorne rode back into Pine Hollow. His coat was finer than it had been, his horse stronger, and the 2 men who flanked him rode with the posture of hired hands too familiar with violence. Silas carried a satchel of documents, deeds, and signatures, and the seal of a county judge who owed him favors. The sheriff shook his hand in public. The mayor welcomed him with a nod. No one mentioned the widow, but a few townsfolk turned their eyes toward Wren's Peak, where smoke had begun to rise with regularity again. "I aim to reclaim what's mine," Silas said. loud enough for the general store to hear. She ran off, left everything behind. No wife of mine no more, and she took what didn't belong to her. He smiled as he said it, and his men smiled too. The town didn't argue. They rarely did with a man holding paper and power. But back on the mountain, Lila planted her first row of onions. Elijah laid a new stone at the edge of the porch, smoothing it into place. The world they were building was real now, and neither of them knew the shadow coming to test its roots. The clatter of hooves echoed down Pine Hollow's main street as Silas Hawthorne dismounted outside the midwife's clinic, dust rising behind him like smoke. His boots hit the ground hard, and his coat swung wide as he adjusted his stance, his hand never far from the pistol at his hip. The two men who rode with him remained mounted, their expressions flat, eyes hidden beneath the brims of their hats. The townsfolk, scattered like leaves on the wind, slipping into shops and ducking behind shuttered windows. The air changed with his presence, cold despite the sun. Inside the clinic, Hester Dunley stood with her back straight, hands already wringing a cloth she'd been using to wash newborn linens. The bell above the door had not yet stopped chiming when Silas pushed through, eyes narrowing as they scanned the room. "Hester," he said, voice smooth as grease and twice as slick. "A pleasure, as always." Compressedy and Paysit, she didn't return the smile. "Silas," he looked around, nodding slowly. "Place looks just like it used to. You haven't changed much either. Still peddling poultices and bleeding the ignorant?" She folded the cloth. "I deliver babies. I mend what I can. Most folks in this town know the difference." He stepped closer. His boots thudded across the wooden floor like drums. "You seen her?" "I see a lot of people." He raised a brow. "Don't play dumb with me. You know who I mean. My brother's widow. She ran off, took things that didn't belong to her. Ain't like she had a right to stay in that house anyway." "She took nothing but her dignity," Hester said evenly. "And not much of that left thanks to you." A flicker of something ugly passed through his eyes. "You always were the meddling sort. Too many opinions for a woman." She stood her ground. "Wherever she is, Silas, I hope she's far from you." "I got legal papers," he said, pulling a folded document from his coat and slapping it onto the counter. "That house is mine, everything in it, including the woman, if I say so. She's not yours. She's mine if I say she is," he snapped, the mask slipping. His hand slammed down on the edge of the counter, making a jar of salve jump. "She was married into the Hawthorns, and she ran. That makes her property that's been stolen. And I aim to get her back." "You're talking about a person, not a mule," Hester said quietly. His smile returned, colder than before. "You like your little clinic, Hester? Like delivering babies and handing out cough syrup to widows and farmers?" She didn't answer. "Be a shame if something happened to this place. Fire's easy to start in old wood." At that, her jaw clenched, but she didn't break. "You tell me where she is," he said, leaning close enough that she could smell the sour edge of whiskey on his breath, "or I start tearing through this town until someone else does." He stepped back, tapped the paper on the counter with a finger. "One way or another, I'm getting what's mine." Then he turned and left, the bell jingling behind him, as though nothing had happened. But Hester stood motionless for a long time, her breath shallow, hands braced on the counter. The town had always tolerated men like Silas, but now his poison had a direction, and it was heading up the mountain. The sky was pale with late spring sun when Elijah left the cabin, rifle slung over his shoulder, and a quiet nod passed to Lila as he stepped down the trail. He was hunting, not far just down past the creek, where deer had begun to return to the lower slopes. Lila watched him go from the window, her hand resting lightly on the sill, her heart steady. The rhythm of their days had become something sacred tasks shared, meals warmed, silence that felt like safety. She had even begun to laugh again, once or twice, catching herself mid-smile and wondering how such a sound had survived in her chest after all she had endured. She was in the garden when it happened, humming softly, gloved hands buried in soil. She heard at first the crunch of boots on the trail, not Elijah's, too heavy, too fast. Her back stiffened before she turned. Silas stood just yards away, sleeves rolled, the deed still stuffed into his coat pocket like a trophy. He grinned, as if they were old friends reunited. "There you are," he said, voice like gravel dragged across stone. "Took me long enough." Lila staggered back a step. "You shouldn't be here." "Shouldn't be? I've come to claim what's mine." "I'm not yours," she said, louder now, firmer. "I never was." That smile faltered, then twisted. Wrong answer. She turned to run, but he moved faster than memory had warned her. His hand clamped around her arm like a vice, yanking her off her feet. The garden fork fell from her grasp, useless in the grass. She kicked, twisted, fought, but he dragged her toward the barn without hesitation. "You think you're safe up here?" he hissed. "You think that old ghost can protect you? He's nothing. He left the world behind like a coward. You belong to me." He shoved her inside the barn and slammed the door. She scrambled to her feet just in time to see him strike a match and toss it into the pile of dry hay. The flame caught instantly, climbing fast, licking up the old boards like they'd been waiting. Lila screamed. Silas yanked the door open again, grabbed her by the arm, and hauled her out into the daylight. Behind them, the barn crackled and roared, black smoke billowing into the blue sky. Down the hill, past the ridge, a boy named Micah, barely 12, and wiry as a willow branch, was walking the trapline his father had taught him. He saw the smoke first, rising dark and furious above the trees. He dropped his snares and bolted, feet pounding earth as fast as his legs would carry him. Lila fought Silas every step as he dragged her down the trail, but her strength was no match. Her screams echoed into the trees, but no one was near enough to hear except the boy who ran like his legs were made of fire. By the time Elijah returned, the barn was a collapsed skeleton of black beams and ash, and Lila was gone. The garden, her garden, still stood untouched. But the world they'd built had been breached, their peace shattered by the man who had never known how to love without possession. The mountain wind howled, but it carried no answer. Not yet. By the time the boy reached town, his breath came in wheezing bursts, his face streaked with soot and sweat. He burst through the doors of the church, where the preacher was locking up after an afternoon sermon, and collapsed against the pews, shouting fragments, fire, smoke, the mountain, a man dragging a woman down the trail. It took a moment for the words to land. Then the preacher's face paled, and the boy repeated, hoarse and certain, "It's the widow. He's taken her. Elijah's barn's burning." Within the hour, word had rippled across Pine Hollow like a dropped stone in still water. Folks who hadn't spoken Elijah Crane's name in years now said it with urgency, some with dread, others with guilt. The memory of what they had done, or failed to do, hung heavy in the air. But it was Hester Dunley who slammed her hand on the counter of the general store and declared the truth with a force that split the silence. "You said he was a monster," she said, voice clear, eyes fierce. "But he's sheltering her from a real one, from a man who's hurt her and would hurt her again. And if you let it happen, if you look away now like you did 20 years ago, then you're no better than him, too, our Cam." The store went still. The blacksmith set down his hammer. The mayor, who had once signed off on Silas Hawthorne's deed transfer without reading the fine print, rubbed his face with both hands. "I've seen Elijah," Hester continued, her voice softer now, but no less sharp. "I've seen the way he moves, the way he carries her water, how he listens when she talks. A man don't vanish for 20 years without a wound, and a man don't open his door to a stranger unless there's goodness still left in him." The preacher stepped forward. "If Silas has her, he'll hurt her. We all know it." A pause. Then the blacksmith nodded. "I'll ride." "So will I," said the preacher. The mayor hesitated, glanced out the window toward the ridgeline, where the last light of day caught the tail end of the black smoke curling skyward. "We've failed before," he said, more to himself than to the others. "Let's not do it again." Saddles were thrown onto horses in haste, shotguns checked, lanterns lit. The boy who'd run down the mountain climbed atop a pony to lead them back, trembling with the urgency of a child who'd seen more than he understood. As the party set off 10 riders strong, with Hester in the lead despite her age, and the preacher gripping the reins with white-knuckled resolve, those who stayed behind gathered in silence along the road. They watched the dust rise behind the hooves and whispered prayers into their palms, The town that had once turned its back on Elijah Crane now turned toward the mountain, not to judge, but to answer a call. And though none said it aloud, they all felt the same tremor beneath their ribs. This time, they would not be too late. Snow began to fall again, soft and slow, as if the sky itself had gone quiet in anticipation. The townsfolk stood gathered in the churchyard, boots sinking into the white as breath curled from their mouths. The preacher had cleared the steps. Hester stood beside him, and the blacksmith leaned on his hammer like it was scripture. The mayor paced nervously near the fence line, glancing down the road where the posse had returned not an hour earlier, leading Silas in with rope at his wrists and a bruise blooming purple beneath his eye. Lila sat beneath the awning, wrapped in Elijah's coat, her face pale but proud. Her lip was split, her cheek red, but her spine remained straight. She said little as Silas sneered and spat, dragging words like blades from his mouth, accusations, lies, bile dressed in confidence. "She ran off," he shouted to the gathered crowd. "Left everything behind. That land is mine. Her husband signed it to me, his own brother. There's papers to prove it." But Lila said nothing. She only reached slowly into her satchel, fingers trembling slightly, and pulled forth a folded letter creased, worn, stained faintly with soot but legible. "I found it weeks ago," she said softly, her voice steady. "Tucked in the lining. My husband wrote it a month before he passed. Silas was never meant to have that land." The preacher took it, read it aloud to all. In it, the words of a dying man, kind, clear, unmistakable. The property was to be passed to his wife alone. The deed Silas had carried into court had been forged. A murmur rose from the crowd. Silas lunged, snarling, but the blacksmith caught him by the collar and slammed him to his knees. Then came the sound of hoofbeats. From the trees emerged Elijah. He was streaked in blood, coat torn, hair damp with melted snow. The men who had seen him in younger days barely recognized the figure that approached now, not hunched or haunted, but upright, burning with something larger than anger. He walked through the crowd without a word, the sea of people parting around him like the wind through wheat. He stopped before Silas and looked down with a stare that could shatter stone. "You touched what wasn't yours," Elijah said, voice deep, raw. "You burned what you didn't build, and you took her like she was a thing you owned." Silas opened his mouth to speak, but no words came, not with Elijah standing over him, not with the town watching. And then came the sheriff. He'd arrived late, summoned by the boy who'd ridden again at dawn, but his timing was righteous. He listened, read the letter, looked into Silas's face, and saw what the rest of them had finally learned to see. The sheriff nodded once. "Bind him. He'll stand trial in the city. We'll see if a judge likes forgeries and bruised women." Silas cursed and spat, but he was hauled to his feet and taken away. The townsfolk turned then not just to Lila, who stood beneath the church's eaves with her head high, but to Elijah, as if seeing him for the first time. Not a ghost, not a rumor, but a man. And this time, they did not turn away. The morning after Silas was taken away, the town awoke to a strange stillness, not the hush of fear or snow, but of something gentler, something like shame passing into grace. The weight of what had happened, what had nearly happened again, lingered in every shop window and pew, in every nod exchanged across fences and porches. And at the center of it stood a man they had once driven to silence, and a woman they had almost let disappear. Elijah did not speak much in the days that followed. He never had. But when he walked through Pine Hollow now, people didn't avert their eyes. They looked at him and nodded, some stiffly, some with the weariness of old guilt. The blacksmith brought him a bundle of nails and lumber without a word. The widow Harper offered a jar of preserves with hands that trembled slightly, and the mayor, red-faced and stammering, apologized in front of the town hall. Elijah merely looked at him for a long moment, then gave the slightest nod. It was enough. Lila stayed by his side, her bruises healing, her steps sure. No one asked her to return to the estate. No one dared. Her husband's letter had become more than legal evidence. It had become proof that her life, her voice, her worth, had never belonged to Silas. It had always been hers. When the preacher came to the cabin with a worn Bible tucked under one arm, Elijah met him on the porch, silent but waiting. They spoke for a while low, slow words under the pines, and when Lila stepped outside, They both turned to her. "It don't have to be a grand thing," the preacher said gently, "but the ground's thawing, and I reckon the time is right, if your hearts are willing." Lila looked to Elijah, searching his face for uncertainty. She found none, only a softness around the eyes, a calm beneath the silence. And so she smiled. They were married that Sunday beneath the trees, where the garden had just begun to stir with early green shoots. Hester tied a ribbon in Lila's hair. The blacksmith carved them a ring from cherry wood. The preacher read simple vows, his voice strong with reverence, and Elijah, when asked, said only one word, yes, but it carried with it every moment of pain and mercy, every step that had brought them there. Lila's eyes brimmed, but did not spill. She held his hands, rough and scarred, and whispered her own vows, like a song half remembered but deeply true. The town came not all, but enough. Children brought wildflowers. The baker sent up a loaf, still warm. No one spoke of the past that day. They only watched as two broken lives stood unbroken before God and pine and firelight, and made something new of what had nearly been lost. That night, the cabin glowed golden from within. No longer a place of retreat, but of return. No longer a tomb, but a home. Spring arrived, like an old friend, returned from war, gentler, slower, and more cherished for the waiting. The snow gave way to earth, soft and fragrant, and the garden that had once been only lines sketched in frost now burst into color. Rows of beans climbed up handmade trellises. Squash blossoms stretched open beneath morning dew. Lila knelt among the stalks with dirt on her palms and sunlight in her hair, humming as she worked, sleeves rolled and cheeks pink with joy. Beside her, Elijah turned the soil with practiced hands, the two of them wordless and content in the kind of silence that no longer weighed, but lifted. The cabin had changed too. The walls had been scrubbed, the windows washed, the roof repaired down to the last stubborn shingle. A new chimney stone had been set where the old had crumbled, and the cradle once buried beneath dust and memory had been rebuilt by Elijah's own hands. It sat now beneath the window, sanded smooth and lined with a new quilt Lila had sewn from scraps of old dresses and shirts, the pieces stitched with hope instead of mourning. But it did not remain empty for long. Word traveled slowly but surely in the hollows about the cabin on Wren's Peak, about the widow and the mountain man who had turned their sorrow into sanctuary. First came a girl of 7, with eyes too old for her face, carried up the trail by a cousin who couldn't feed her, then a brother and sister left parentless after a fire down in Coal Ridge. Hester brought the last two herself, twins whose mother had passed during a rough winter birth. Each child came with scars, some visible, most not. Elijah never asked questions. He only built more cots. Lila read to them each night, her voice soft and even, and taught them how to write their names in the dirt before they ever touched a slate. They planted rows together in the garden and gathered eggs at dawn. They learned to trust the quiet, to find safety in the steady rhythm of work and warmth, and supper shared beneath low lamplight. The town began to call them the family on the hill. Sometimes it was said with awe, sometimes with a smile, and every now and then with the humbled reverence reserved for miracles. The preacher came often, bringing books and warm bread. The blacksmith taught the older boys how to mend tools. No one questioned the way Elijah stood a little straighter now, or how Lila's laugh had returned with such brightness it made even the trees seem to lean in and listen. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in rose and violet, Elijah stood at the edge of the garden, watching Lila cradle the smallest of the twins against her chest. The baby's fist curled around her braid, and her lips moved with the beginnings of a lullaby. He looked around the home they had rebuilt, the children chasing fireflies across the yard, the garden that swayed like a hymn, and felt a stillness inside him that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with peace. He stepped inside the cabin, lit the lantern, and left the door wide open.